Shalom, and welcome to Parsha Pairings with Jeff and Sherry. I'm Jeff Friedlander.
And I'm Sherry.
And we're glad to have you with us. This week, we're in Parsha Vayera. This is out of Genesis chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 24. The Haftorah this week is 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1 through 37. And the Brit Hadashah is Luke 1, 26 to 38, Luke 24, 36 to 53, and 2 Peter 2, 4 through 11. Now, the meaning of this title, Vayera, is "and he appeared," and it comes from the first part of this parsha. And I want to give you a common thread between these three, the Torah, the Haftorah, and the New Testament. In the Torah portion, we are going to read about Abraham and Sarah, and they're going to go from being barren to giving birth to Isaac in their old age, and it's a miracle. It's a promise, and it's a promise that gets fulfilled, and it sets the seed for the coming of the Messiah in the days to come. It is truly miraculous. And then God is going to deliver his son Isaac from death, and Isaac from death, he provides a ram. So we have a resurrection type feeling here. The Haftorah is Elisha prophesying to the Shunammite woman who was also barren. And he tells her, in a year, you're going to have a child. She does have a child, miraculously. This child also dies. Isaac was about to die and saved. This child does die. Elisha comes, lays on top of the child, breathes life back into the child, and the child comes back resurrected from the dead. Again, foreshadowing the Messiah to come and life from the dead through a miraculous birth. Then finally, in the Brit Hadashah, we read the story of Yeshua, the fulfillment, actually being born to a virgin, the miraculous birth that was given. We also read that it was conceived by the Spirit of God, the Ruach. And that is the same Spirit that God used to speak to Abram. That's the same Spirit that God used in Elisha to raise the Shunammite woman's son.
Powerful.
And so this thread goes straight through. We also read about the end of Yeshua's life after he has died and been resurrected. And in this parsha, we talk about the ascension, him going to heaven and preparing a place for all of us to come for one day when he comes back and receives us. So there's a beautiful theme in these Parsha readings this week, and I hope you'll enjoy studying those. So we're going to get into an outline now of just the Torah portion, and we're also going to record a few other videos because there's so much. This particular,
it's a rich Parsha.
It is. This one is a big one, and it's too much to handle in 20 or 30 minutes to get all the details. So we're going to try just to break it down for you, give you some highlights from it, and we'll pick up a few nuggets along the way. Sherry, if we look at chapter 18 of this, what we see is Abraham is recovering from circumcision. Why don't you tell us what happens throughout this chapter?
Right, so we know he's recovering from circumcision because chapter 17 ended with that. Our Parsha last week ended with the circumcision. And of course, there were no chapter headings in the scrolls, and this Parsha opens with, "Then Adonai appeared to him at Mamre's large tree." What is the then? After the circumcision.
Right.
So we see that he appears to him. Now, it's interesting that this phrase, Adonai appeared, this is the third time that we've seen this in Abram's life. We've seen other phrases where the Lord talked to him, he heard the voice, but actually Adonai appearing to him.
Yeah.
This is the third time we see this, and this is very significant.
This is big.
We've talked about this, I think, in the last Parsha, that this is what would be considered a theophany.
Right.
This is when God himself manifests himself on the earth in a form, a human form, that we're able to see, we're able to interact with, we're able to relate to in some way. Now, it's not all of God, because we could not stand in the presence of all of God, but this theophany, this form, is something that Abraham was able to relate to. He even made food for him.
He makes dinner for him, and they actually eat. So this human form of God is capable of food. And interestingly, the Jewish sages throughout the centuries have agreed that this was a theophany, even though in latter times, Middle Ages 4, they've argued against it being Yeshua in a pre-incarnate state. They did believe for centuries upon centuries that this was God in human form on the earth. So that's not really a debatable point even among the Jewish sages.
Right. So we see Adonai appears, and then in verse 2, when Abraham lifted up his eyes to see, behold, there were 3 men standing right by him. When he saw them, he ran to the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed down to the ground. So he recognizes this heavenly host that's come now to speak with him.
So we have God, and we got 2, they're called messengers. They could be angels, messengers. They're heavenly beings that are with God. How'd you like to be the honor guard there? That'd be kind of cool, right? Anyway, sorry.
So in verse 3, we see Abraham says, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant." That word used there for Lord is a very interesting word. It's actually the word Adoni. And it's used a lot of times to represent a physical king, but it's also used in Psalm 110 verse 1, which is considered a prophetic messianic psalm written by David, where it says, Adonai declares to my Lord. Adonai, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, declares to Adoni, my Lord, sit at my right hand.
And that's a divine prophetic word of Psalm 110.
So we see that there is something going on, that the divine author of the Torah is laying the groundwork for us to understand that God himself can manifest himself on the earth.
That's right.
And then we go on to see the great hospitality that Abraham shows to his guests. He washes their feet, offers them water, offers them bread. He even has Sarah make fresh bread. He goes and picks out an oxen or some sort of an animal. My version says oxen. I think there's some others that say goats and whatever. So he prepares this meat. Butter, curds, and he serves this to his guests.
That was a lot of work.
Especially post-circumcision.
Yeah, he'd just been circumcised. In fact, the sages teach that it was only 3 days after, which would be the height of the pain and recovery. But I've always thought about this, like, how long does it take to go slaughter an animal, clean the meat out, cook the meat, make the milk, do the goat, cheese, all this stuff? I mean, this was not like, hey, I think I'll open up the fridge. You want me to warm up something in the microwave? This was work. And yet, for Abraham, it didn't feel like work. It was absolutely what he wanted to do.
So he blesses them, refreshes them. And then in verse 9, we see that this was another place where we see this theophany at play in the language here. Verse 9, it says, Then they said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? Well, there in the tent, he said. And verse 10 says, Then he said. So we have a they that are asking, where's Sarah? But then he, being Adonai, actually says, I most assuredly will return to you in about a year's time. Behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. So he's been encountering Abraham this whole time with this seed promise, this promise of the seed, the land, and the blessing. And he reiterates again to say, now it's time. In about a year, I'm going to come back, and she's going to have that baby.
Wow.
And of course, Sarah responds in great faith by laughing.
Laughter's a sign that you believe it.
She laughs.
She's definitely bought in, no question.
She laughs, and they confront her about that, to which she says, oh, no, I didn't laugh.
Whoa, I'm caught. I better come up with a quick story.
So then, I love this. Adonai said to Abraham, why is it that Sarah laughed? Can I really give birth when I am old? And then God says this, is anything too difficult for Adonai? At the appointed time, the Moed, I will return to you in about a year, and Sarah will have a son. That term, in about a year, actually means in the time of life.
That's so cool.
Translated out of Hebrew is in the time of life. He'll return, and then God's going to provide the miracle that he's promised. So then we go on. The angels leave. They go on to Sodom. We'll see them next chapter. But Adonai is still hanging out with Abraham, and they're talking, and Adonai says, I'm going to tell Abraham what I'm about to do. I'm not going to keep a secret from him. And why is he not going to keep a secret from him? He says in verse 19, For I have made myself known to him, so that he will command his sons and his household after him to keep the way of Adonai by doing righteousness and justice, so Adonai may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. So he's going to share with with him what he's about to do, and he does. And then we get
Yeah.
the famous negotiation between Abraham and God.
Yeah.
Okay, so God, what if there are 50 in Sodom?
If there are 50, I will let them be.
What about 45?
45, done deal.
40?
Yeah, okay.
How about 30?
Come on now.
20?
20.
Okay, I don't mean to come back, but one more time. What about 10?
That's it. 10.
So Adonai agrees. If there are 10 righteous men,
Right.
the key is righteous men, in Sodom, I will not destroy it.
Yeah.
And this is how chapter 18 ends.
And then we kick into chapter 19, and we read probably one of the most disturbing stories of the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, it's just terrible. This chapter recounts the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot and his family. But in the midst of that, we just see some destruction here. Now, Lot is considered a righteous man. Even 2 Peter says that Lot was righteous. And obviously, he did get rescued by this. And so there's some righteousness. But Lot's life, Sherry, is a life of compromise.
It is.
He's made a lot of success, but in his success, he's compromised his values. He's willing to kind of sell out things. He's risen to a place of power here at Sodom. He's at the city gate, which is a place of kind of the city council, if you will. And here at the gate, the angels arrive. They come to his house. They knock on the door, and he sees them, and he's like, hey, okay, that's a big deal. He invites them in. He shows them hospitality. He gives them food. He makes a meal for them. And then the city, Sodom and Gomorrah, surrounds Lot's house to try and take away these men. They actually decide, we want to sodomize these men. We are gonna take them and do a sexually immoral act with them. And Lot is like, hey now.
No.
As much as I compromise, I can't go there. That's not going to work. And so he offers his daughters to these men, which in our mind, we have to be thinking to ourselves, wait a minute.
Who does that? What kind of a father does that?
You're saying that's the righteousness of Lot? Obviously, in ancient Near East culture, there's some things that are difficult to understand. And by the way, not only can we not understand this, but we also really can't justify it. Hospitality was big. It would start wars. If you were inhospitable, you showed disrespect, a war would break out. Right. You could be killed for it. It was a major faux pas, if you will. That being said, to offer your daughters, Lot apparently had come to a conclusion that the lesser of two evils was to have his virgin daughters offered up to be abused sexually versus having his guest be abused homosexually and raped. Neither of those choices is good. And maybe neither of those choices was necessary, but it is what Lot decided. And we see that his compromised heart creates a pretty bad decision here. So the angels prevent either from happening. Fortunately, they stop it, and then they say, we got to go. So they get up to go immediately, and they leave. And when they leave some of the family behind, sons-in-law, which could have been sons-in-law of other daughters of Lot. It could have been the betrothed sons of the two virgin daughters. In any case, there were not 10.
The scripture's not clear on which went with them.
There were not 10 righteous people.
Right.
And so they leave, and on their way out of town, Lot's wife looks back, but the scripture in Hebrew says she looked intently, and it could have been translated as she went back. It's possible that she not only turned to watch, she might have turned and taken a step. In other words, Sodom just did not leave her heart. She did not want to be out of there at that point. Wow. And so Lot is got some pretty significant things going on here. And one commentator writes this about Lot, and I think this is a point we should just make before we move into chapter 20, and that is, Lot was into the world and into God. And the compromise of both trying to live the double life did not work well. In fact, the commentator says, he had too much of the world to be happy in the Lord, and too much of the Lord to be happy in the world. If we're in that place today, I would just encourage you, you need to choose. You can't be in both camps.
Can't be double-minded.
Can't be double-minded.
Tossed by the wind.
The stress is terrible. So they leave, they go to Zoar, they leave there, they go up to a cave because apparently Zoar didn't satisfy them, so a cave was better. Lot gets drunk, he goes right into misery, he gets drunk, and his daughters have sex with him in an incestual way in order to preserve the seed of Lot's line in their mind. They have completely separated themselves from anything that makes sense at this point, because there were men on the earth, even though they act like there are no men. They were of the marrying age. They could have gotten married again, even though they think they can't. They have put themselves in an insane position to believe God could not save them when God had just saved them. And they did not trust God. And because of that, they create two nations. One is the Moabites, and two is the Amorites. And those two nations, Ammonites, excuse me, thank you.
All the rights and the ites get mixed up.
And out of those two nations, we see a lot of evil, a lot of warfare. But out of the nation of Moabite, God does do a restorative work that came through Lot. And that was a daughter that comes many years later named Ruth.
Who's a Moabite.
Who was a Moabite.
We're going to see the Moabites again.
Yeah, Ruth will become the grandmother of King David and be in the line of succession to Yeshua, our Messiah. So God redeems even this horrible situation on Abraham's behalf, possibly. Right. And so it's a tough story, but it's one that we have to take warnings from. All right, let's move into chapter 10, Sherry.
All right, so chapter 20.
I mean 20. I said chapter 10.
You're on verse 10.
We're not going back up. Okay,
so chapter 20, after this, the destruction, Abram moves a little further south into the Negev, it says, in southern Israel, and he encounters Abimelech again, Abimelech of Gerar. Now, Abimelech is more than likely the title of a person as opposed to his name.
And this is in the Philistine area, and there's some other scriptures that talk about almost always this Philistine kings call him an Abimelech. So you're spot on with that idea. That,
so Abimelech, he encounters Abimelech. Now, interesting, this land of Gerar, this is not the first time we've seen this. We actually saw this back in Genesis 10:19 when we were reading the genealogies of Ham. And it says that Canaan, his son, part of his borders are mentioned as Gerar.
Wow.
So this land that we're in right now is the lot of Ham, who was the cursed son from Noah.
Yeah.
Who, interestingly enough, was more than likely sexual sin that happened between Ham and Noah.
That's right.
And then here we are in this area of Sodom and Gerar, in this area where we have again sexual sin. The sins of the fathers repeated in the lives of their sons. So then we're also, just as a highlight, we're also going to encounter this town again and Abimelech again in next week's Parsha. And we're going to see the sin of the father again as Isaac faces him and also lies about his daughter, his wife, Rebecca. But in our Parsha this week, Abraham, again, he meets Abimelech and he lies and says, this is my sister, and she agrees to it. So Abimelech takes Sarah into his household, thinking, well, okay, she's free game, right? So he takes her, but an interesting thing happens. God appears to Abimelech in a dream. He shows up in a dream and speaks to him. So somehow Abimelech recognizes Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. He recognizes who he is. And here's what God says, the opening line in verse 3. Behold, you're as good as dead.
Hello.
Because the woman whom you have taken, because she's a married woman. So God confronts him. And I really think what God is doing here is protecting Sarah.
Yeah, he's protecting Sarah.
He's protecting her as the seed bearer for the promised son Isaac that Abimelech doesn't. It says later on that Abimelech doesn't even come near her. Because of God steps right in, and even in Abraham's sin, God steps in to protect the seed bearer of Sarah.
And interestingly, Sherry, you say protecting the seed bearer, and that is absolutely true. And we see a precursor here in addition to that since she is a married woman, thou shalt not commit adultery. Here it is that, hey, you're a dead man if you commit adultery here.
Yeah.
She's married. You can't take her.
You can't take her. Yeah. So then he has a conversation with the Lord, and he says, listen, I didn't know that. I did it with integrity of heart. In verse 6, God replies to him. He says, then God said to him in a dream, yes, I myself knew that you did this with integrity of your heart. So I myself prevented you from sinning against me.
Yeah.
That is why I did not allow you to touch her. So now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, a Nevi'im. This is actually the first time we see the word prophet in the scripture, is God identifying Abraham as a prophet. Let him pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, know that you will surely die, and you and all who are yours. And then it says, early the next day.
Hello.
He got right on it. Abimelech wasted no time.
Yeah, he doesn't waste any time,
on it.
right?
And he gives plunder to Abraham, just as Abraham got in Egypt.
Yeah.
He left with a lot of wealth. And he even pays a restitution price for Sarah's honor to show that there was no dishonor done here. And then in verse 17.
And I would say, before you go on there, that word early, it is important for us to realize. When God speaks, we should respond, everybody. We shouldn't just sit and wait. If God says something, don't ponder it. Act on it.
Even the Canaanite king knew that.
Yeah. I mean, he's like, okay, I got a bad dream. I'll be dead. Okay. Hey, not going to be doing this.
Well, and we also read that the wombs of all of his wife and his slaves had been closed. Apparently, he got sick in some way. I mean, there was plague that came over them because of this. And verse 17 and 18 ends with, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves, so that they could bear children. For Adonai had completely locked up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So I think it's interesting. God protects Sarah's womb from not being violated, and he closes all of Abimelech's wombs in his household, but then he does bring the blessing back to open it back up, because he's preserved Sarah's.
Wow.
So there's just a lot of interesting word plays that go on here, and subplots that are happening here, but Abraham gets free again from his lie, and God is protecting Sarah and protecting her integrity.
And then we jump into chapter 21, where we see the birth of Isaac. And this is the miracle baby, right? This is what we've been talking about, what's been prophesied in Abraham's world. We've seen it for 4 or 5 chapters now, that he has been prophesied. He is born, he is circumcised on the 8th day. That is the promised child. He's the first one. Now, we don't know when Abraham circumcised Ishmael and his servants and all them, were there children there? We don't know that answer. We can presume there were probably some kids there. So we can't state a biblical fact that this is the first 8-day-old that was ever circumcised.
It is the first
recorded. But it is definitely the first recorded one. That we can state. This is the first recorded 8-day-old that was circumcised, and therefore this is the first one to be circumcised according to the covenant, the commitment, the contract, and the promise. All the different things that have gone through with Abraham and God. Now it's in process. Now it's been signed. Now there's a sign. This is it. Now going forward. So Isaac, in that sense, is a type of the Messiah. He's a messianic prophecy. In fact, he and Yeshua shared a common thread. They were both promised sons of God, and they were both born through miracles.
Right.
And they did both get circumcised on the 8th day. But so in this chapter, we read about a conflict that comes up, though, between Ishmael, the older son, from Hagar, the Egyptian slave, and from Isaac, okay? The jealousy of Ishmael and from Hagar leads Sarah to remove Hagar again. This is the second time. Yeah, this is the second time. She removes her again from the family, and now they're out there. And this battle now between Sarah and Hagar, it's upsetting. To Abraham, regardless, he loves Ishmael. He loves Sarah. He certainly is going to and does love Isaac. But he loves Ishmael. It's his son. And he's not happy about this. So they get out in the wilderness, and they get out there, and Abraham, it says, now it came about that same time that Abimelech, the Philcol, the commander of his army, said to Abram, God is with you in all that you do. So now make a pledge to me here by God that you will not violate your word with me or my descendants or with my offspring. And I have shown loyalty to you. Show the same to me and to the land in which you have lived as an outsider. So Abraham is living as an outsider. And I think I skipped a verse there because there's a verse before that. You can go pick it up and read it yourself, where Abraham is praying to God that God would rescue Ishmael, because Ishmael and his mom Hagar have run out of water, and God sends an angel to them. He provides for them, and he lets Abraham know they're going to be taken care of. And that's what we want to make sure you realize, is that God is going to take care of them.
Yeah.
And then back, what verse was that?
In verse 14 it says, so Abram got up early in the morning and he took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar.
Yeah.
And she put it on her shoulders and that of the child, and they went away. And then when the water was finished, she began praying. And God answers the prayer and takes care of her. Right. And then we come back to this Abimelech story, where I started to read a little ahead there for you, in verse 22 and 23. And what ends up happening is Abraham and Abimelech make an agreement with each other. They make a covenant with one another because there was some conflict going on. But Abraham had lived there and is living there. He stays there for a long time. He actually stays in this land for quite a while. So they make a covenant together, and there had been a problem with the well. There had been an argument. Verse 25 says, Abraham had rebuked Abimelech because of the well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. Abimelech says, I don't know what you're talking about. Abraham says, well, take a flock of sheep, take some cattle. He gives them to him, and they make a covenant. Again, here we have a blood covenant again being shown between Abimelech and Abraham. So this blood and this commitment to one another, it's very prevalent in his life. And at the end of this, Abraham stays in the land, and he plants a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and he calls on the name of Adonai, the everlasting God. And then it ends in this chapter with him saying he lives as an outsider in this land of the Philistines. So he's calling on the name of God, but he lives as an outsider because the promise is not his yet. He doesn't have possession yet. And then we get to kind of the creme de la creme of the whole story, which we're just going to touch on today. In another video, we're going to go into detail. But Sherry, this is the pinnacle of the moment for Abraham's life. Chapter 22 is the pinnacle, and it's a huge foundation stone for our faith as well. This is the binding of Isaac, or in Hebrew, the Akedah. Yeah. The Akedah.
Which means binding.
And it opens with saying that Adonai tested Abraham. And this word test means to prove, to try, or to put to prove. Now, it's interesting that the sages actually say that Abraham has already passed 9 tests. There's 10 total, with the Akedah being the most severe. What are the tests? Well, he had to already leave his father. He had to leave his birthplace, and he had to leave his father's house. So
there's 3 tests.
He had to give up the land that resembled Gan Eden. Remember when
we talked about that
with Lot, how Lot said, I'm going to take the better land. That was a test. He had to fight an international empire. Remember the story of the 5 kings versus the 4 kings with his measly 318 men that he went to go and rescue Lot. That was a test. He had to expel his concubine and his son twice. He's had to go through this process of sending them away because his wife is jealous and can't handle it, and what pain it brought to his heart. Then he had to circumcise himself and his whole household out of faith.
And that's a test.
And this is, a grown man circumcising grown men who, that's not an easy thing to get them to come on board to that. But he was so faithful to God. And finally, he also relinquished the spoils of war to an evil king. When he went to that war, the international war, and they offered him all the spoils, he said, I'll not take anything from you because nobody's going to make me rich but God and God alone. So he's passed all these tests, and it's so interesting that in every one of these instances, he hears God say and he obeys.
Wow.
Shema.
And
actually the word Shema is used in verse 18, and we'll get to that in a minute. So just one or two other little small things we want to take out of this passage, because we're going to do, like you said, a video on the Akedah with more depth and looking into it a little deeper. But in verse 22, it opens up with Adonai saying, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains about which I will tell you." There's a lot of nuggets we can pull out of that one verse.
Yeah.
One, Moriah. Now, Moriah is the mountain that stands over that Valley of Kings that we talked about in last week's Parsha.
Right.
When Abram was coming back down from the international war, and he meets Melchizedek in the Valley of the Kings. We talked about that today is the modern Kidron Valley. So we've already seen this valley. So Abraham is familiar with this area.
Yeah.
He knows where he's going.
You can review that in our video on Melchizedek.
Right. Incidentally, the first time we saw the Valley of the Kings, his name hadn't been changed. He was still Abram.
Right.
And now he's getting ready to go back to that area as Abraham with the name change. It also tells us that he's going to go up and give a burnt offering. That's the Olah offering. This is the sin offering. This will be codified later in Sinai when we'll see the 5 different types of offering, with this burnt offering, the Olah offering, being for sin. What's interesting about that is this is the first mention that we have of a man being told to be offered as a sin offering.
That's big.
This is the big crux of the faith that we believe in, that Yeshua, a man, could be put to death to cover our sins. We have it right here in this Akedah, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But after the Akedah, the way that this, after the Akedah, in verse 17 and 18, it tells us that the angel of Adonai called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I swear, it is a declaration of Adonai, because you have done this thing and did not withhold your son, your only son." What's God going to do? "I will richly bless you and bountifully multiply your seed like the stars of heaven, the sands of the seashore. Your seed will possess the gate of his enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And because you obeyed, you shema my voice."
Wow.
God wraps it all up and says, reiterates the promise. He adds into it now this element of possession of the enemy's gates. This goes back to that promise of Genesis 3:15 that the seed of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent. She's going to crush the enemy of God. Her seed is. We see the elements of that again here in this family line. God is anointing. And the nations are going to be blessed.
Yes.
Not just the one nation God's going to pull out. All the nations will be blessed. And then finally, our chapter ends pointing us forward again. It ends with another lineage. Remember our couple of parshas ago, it ended with the lineage of Terah. Well, this one picks up Nahor, which is Abraham's brother. Now, Nahor stayed in Ur. He did not leave with Terah, and he didn't leave with Abram. He stayed. And it's interesting, we see that they show all the kids that he has, but we hear the birth announcement of Rebekah, who we're actually going to encounter in next week's Parsha. So this week ends pointing us to next week's Parsha.
And it carries on the tradition of the seed, the lineage of the seed going from Adam forward. And Rebekah will become with Isaac, and that will carry the seed further. We hope you've enjoyed this Parsha Pairings on Vayera, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Parsha Pairings. Shalom.
Shalom.